We're getting through it. We're now on paragraph 16 on prorations and the assessments from the HOA, if there are any. So as it says here, the following will be prorated to the closing date. So taxes that are due this year are actually payable next year. So the taxes we pay this year are for last year. So generally, most of us check most recent mill levy and most recent assessed valuation. And we check that, and then let's say we're closing on June 30th. The seller would be responsible for the taxes while they own the property. So January 1st through June 30th will be the obligation of the seller, and that will be taken out at closing. Then the rest of the year will be the obligation of the buyer, but they won't have to pay that until next year. And don't worry, they'll send you the bill. If you're buying a rental property, you've got choices here. If you're closing on the 1st, the seller may not have already gotten the rents. Even though they're due on the 1st, they might not have been paid. Everybody's a few days late, they get a little slack time. So you might want to check accrued. That means that you want to be paid for the rents that are due for this month. So unless it's like the second half of the month, everything should be already paid in, then it doesn't matter really which one you do. In addition, the seller has to pass on all the security deposits that they've collected. It's not their money, and it will be passed on to you, and then you will be responsible for that when the tenant or tenants move out. And the seller has to assign all the leases to the buyer, and the buyer has to assume those obligations. So once you get in, if you're buying a rental property, you don't get the opportunity to change that lease in the middle. You have to wait until it expires, and then you can put up a new one and see if the renter will go for that. The association dues are generally paid a year in advance. So if we're, say, again, closing on June 30th, and the renter or the seller has paid for the entire year, they will get credit for the money they've paid that would cover July 1st through the end of the year. And the buyer will be responsible for that part. The buyer may also have to pay at closing reserves or working capital that is put up by the association. It says any assessment assessed prior to the closing date by the association will be the obligation of the buyer or seller. You have to choose one here. However, improvements that have already been installed by the time this contract is signed by the buyer, then the seller is responsible for it, whether it's been collected or not. And all these prorations are final. So number 17, we get into possession when you actually get to own the property. Generally, we've already said the date and time at the contract, and that's will be in force. So it's generally the date and time of closing will be the same as the possession time and date. However, if the seller fails to move out or get all this stuff out, then they're subject to eviction and will be additionally liable for a payment. So you might put in a couple $100 a day to motivate the seller to get out on time, as you would hope, so you can move in on time. So here you have to check if you're the buyer, if you're going to live in it or if you're not going to live in it. If you're buying it as a rental, you have to check that you do not represent that you're going to occupy it as your principal residence. So be honest on that. If you're going to move into it, you leave that blank. If you're going to be a landlord, you check the does not box. And then here, if the seller will not be out by closing, and sometimes that's agreed to ahead of time, you can check this box, and then the buyer and seller will execute a post-closing occupancy agreement. So maybe the seller needs a couple weeks before their new house will be ready, so you can do what's called a lease back, and you will work up an agreement with the seller, and they will agree to pay you, let's say it's 2 weeks rent, and they will stay in it until then, and then they'll move out, and then that's all okay. So that's it, and then we get to general provisions. We're getting towards the end.